All right, so I want to go back to a distinction that I made toward the beginning of this section between physical aggression and relational aggression. And I want to spend a little more time talking about relational aggression specifically because it's a type of aggression that we tend to kind of forget about or underemphasize. Because, when we think about aggression, you think about generally physical, violent things like that. But relational aggression can be really, really important and is around us more than we tend to think. So relational aggression is still very important. We know it affects people in very real ways. We don't want to minimize the effects of this and how it might hurt people and change their lives. And I think maybe one way to underscore this is to just point out that the types of pain that we experience on a day-to-day basis, a lot of people don't have the experience of having violence perpetrated against them very often, if ever, for some people. So it isn't something that people are experiencing that regularly, but we tend to feel a lot more emotional pain, and it hurts us in some different and some similar ways, and some of those are more similar than we like to think. There's a lot of good neuropsychology evidence showing that a lot of the same parts of the brain are activated when people feel social or emotional pain compared to physical pain. And if you have ever, been excluded, it kind of seems, I think when you say it, sometimes people might belittle it, but being excluded or having rumors spread about you is a very painful experience, right? It's something that, especially if you know someone's doing it with very ill intent, it can really hurt in much the same way that some kind of physical pain can hurt, or at least in an analogous way. So it is important to think, I think, about some different examples of this. So trying to cause harm to somebody's relationships or social standing is an example of relational aggression, but it also just might be threatening to do that. So it can hurt someone's feelings or hurt them emotionally to even tell them that you're going to harm them socially or threaten to do that. And if, that might be the act that people are intending to do to hurt that other person. So that still kind of qualifies under our definition of aggression. Bringing someone down in their social network and making people think worse of them. We live very social lives, and trying to deal with our standing and our how we kind of see ourselves reflected in the views of others can be really impactful on us. There are some good suggestions that this is probably something that was evolutionarily adaptive. So if you were taking down other people with rumors or damaging their social standing, it might have been an adaptive thing in our ancestral environment, because you might be able to kind of elevate your own status socially by bringing other people down, and then have better standing to then, attract and maintain reproductive partners by belittling your rivals. And this is also something that starts relatively early in life. Toddlers even engage in relational aggression sometimes, and it also tends to differ between men and women. In boys and girls as young as 2.5 years old, there starts to be a difference in the rates of relational aggression. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But just some, examples. You might think about kids that are, playing on a slide, a pair of kids that are playing. Somebody comes over and starts talking to them, and the two kids that started out are kind of covering their ears and going la 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 to block out that third person. Or something like two kids are playing in the corner of a classroom, and one of them takes away a block that the other one wants or something. And the kid that, gets the block taken away says, "I won't be your best friend anymore if you don't give me that block." that's something they're doing to, manipulate the social standing, or at least threaten the social standing of another kid, or excluding them from things that are going on. So ignoring other people, whether, in a realistic way or not, or excluding them socially from something, they might, seem silly, but again, these can be kind of extremely impactful things on people that can be used for very specific harmful purposes. One of the reasons it's important to focus on relational aggression is because most of the research previously has been about physical aggression. It's used more male participants, and it's thought about aggression in a more male-centric sort of way. And because of this might not make the research on aggressive overall all that representative or have a lot of explanatory power as it might if we were a little more even in how we thought about it. And if we're only studying, more physical types of aggression, or other like stereotypically male ways of aggressing, this might possibly suggest that there aren't as big of differences in aggression as we have tended to think historically. So if we look at if we break down different types of aggression between boys and girls, at least in early childhood, there are some trends that are worth thinking about. So this is some rates of aggression from boys and girls from ages 2.5 to 5. And if you look at their overall rates of aggression, they're both, indicating that over this observation period, around a quarter of boys, a little more than a quarter, a little less than a quarter of girls were engaging in aggression. So boys do seem to be a little more aggressive than girls. But if you were to only study physical aggression, for example, you would think that boys are pretty aggressive and girls are not aggressive at all, because almost 16% of boys are engaging in some kind of physical aggression and almost no girls are. But if you flip that and look at relational aggression, it's almost exactly the opposite, that over 17% of girls are engaging in relational aggression, and boys tend not to do it very often at all. And then in this particular study, they looked at kind of combinations of those, where people were engaging in both. And this, you kind of see a little bit of the makeup in the trends that boys tend to kind of combine them more often than girls do, which kind of muddies up the sort of clear differences that we see above, but they still, seem to bear out overall. If you only, instead of looking at these three separately, if you coded only physically aggressive, so boys engaging in any physically aggressive behavior in this category here or this category here, then a quarter of boys are being aggressive and only, less than a 20th of girls are being aggressive. And if you code only relationally aggressive things, boys are about 1 in 10, girls are about 1 in 5. So these differences, no matter how you slice it, there are pretty big differences between physical and relational aggression. And if you only focus on one, then you're really not getting the whole picture of what's going on as far as aggression in childhood. When you get a little bit older, past those kind of preschool ages, ways that we might aggress relationally might get a little more complex. Talking about people behind their back, trying to steal romantic partners, trying to embarrass people publicly, or ways that relational aggression might rear its head after those ages. When we get to early adulthood, you still tend to see a lot of those other things I already mentioned, but you might, trying to emphasize the attention you're getting from other people and engage in really focused types of gossip, or intentionally being really cold to other people. One way that relational aggression tends to happen, and one way that it tends to be kind of easy to research, is by excluding people or ostracizing them. So excluding them, whether you're not letting them engage in some sort of activity with you or just ignoring them completely, these both tend to fall under the rubric of ostracism. And if you're left out, if you're ostracized or excluded, you tend to feel a lot of bad emotions and have a lot of bad cognitions that are related to that. You feel alone and anxious. You feel like you're not as important as other people, and you don't have much control going on. One way that people have tended to study this, ever since people, started really using different computerized ways of conducting laboratory experiments, is something called cyberball. Cyberball, it looks kind of silly. There are more complex ways of doing this, but it still tends to work, even though it looks kind of rudimentary and, honestly, like something from the internet in the late 90s, which it kind of was. But cyberball is just basically a computerized game of catch, where you are, represented by this hand down here, and there can be any other number of people that you might program in, and they might be real and they might not be, depending on the study. But oftentimes in these studies, these people are not real. You're told that you're playing catch with them, but you're really not. And for a while, the game of catch is pretty equitable. They're throwing it to random people. But then after a little bit, they just start playing with each other, and you are left out. And that's kind of the manipulation. You're ostracized by these people. And they might, under some circumstances, be strangers. You might be told they're your friends. They might be people from a different group. There's lots of different ways you can run these types of studies. But the main thing is that you are included at the beginning, and then eventually you're excluded, and then researchers look at how that might affect you. One really interesting study on this kind of manipulated the groups that people were in. So some people were told that they were playing this game with people that were of the same political party as them, people in what we might call their in-group, or people that thought they were talking or playing catch with the opposing political party, so a rival outgroup that they might not like quite as much or might want to impress or something in some ways. And some people were told that they were playing catch with a group of people that they might really, really dislike. So they were told they were playing with members of the hate group, the Ku Klux Klan. So under these conditions, they wanted to see if there were differences in how people felt after they were ostracized. And I told you some of the things that ostracized people feel. And in this study, people that were left out in cyberball, even though it's kind of this silly-looking game, they felt lower sense of belonging in general. They felt less in control. Their self-esteem took a hit. And they even felt like existence in general was less meaningful. So that's really, sad, but still very interesting. But maybe the most interesting thing is that these effects didn't differ at all depending on these groups. Even if they, you might expect people to feel more left out or worse if they were left out by their in-group, but they felt the same if they were left out by their out-group. They even disliked, or they even felt all these bad things if it was from a despised out-group, like a hate group that they were not able to play with. So being ostracized, no matter who is doing it, can really hurt. And maybe part of this is because, you're feeling like, wow, even the people that I really have negative feelings about are not wanting to associate with me or something like that. So the mechanisms might be different, but the results from all different types of groups excluding you tend to be these same sort of negative outcomes. Another way that researchers have studied ostracism in the laboratory is by bringing people into the lab and having them meet with other participants, basically, or so they're told, and exchange text messages with those people. So generally, the way this is done and was done in this study is that a participant comes to the lab and two other people are already there to participate. One person, just so there is not like a huge gender imbalance in the studies, the way they ran this one, it was always one man and one woman that were the other two people. But the twist is that both of those people are in on the study. So there's one real participant and two people waiting that are part of the study, basically. And what they did in this one was gave all of them phones to text each other with and answer these different questions that they were given by the experimenter. So they're all doing this kind of get-to-know-you sort of task. And after they do that, they're told to just interact and have conversations with each other for a little while after that. Then what the manipulation is that either participants are included, they have 8 minutes of, kind of benign or polite conversation over text messages, or no one of those other two people responds to the participant. They don't respond to them, they don't text them, they're just texting with each other the whole time. So they're excluded or they're included. And when you run this study, you see kind of the same pattern of results we see across all these other ostracism studies. They don't feel like they belong in general or in that situation. They don't feel like they have much control. Their self-esteem takes a hit, and they feel more angry. So, even with strangers in a laboratory and this kind of weirdly stilted task, there are these big outcomes for not being included. And I've talked too about how social pain in some senses is, as impactful or just as impactful as physical pain on us. And this is important to kind of notice these two links, that physical aggression leads to physical pain. Relational aggression really does lead to a real type of pain that we might call social or emotional pain. And there is research on how this might really be related to the same sorts of biological mechanisms as physical pain. So in a study by Nathan DeWall, he and some colleagues had people take Tylenol or placebo twice a day, just as a part of their regular routine. And they did this for 3 weeks, and they, just reported things about how they were feeling and doing over those 3 weeks, and how much social pain they felt was the key variable they were looking at here. And over the course of the study, there were big reductions in how much their feelings were hurt and social pain that they were experiencing if they were the ones taking Tylenol. So, this is kind of a hard to believe study in some ways, which probably means it is a good candidate to try to replicate and show that this is a really reliable effect and try to show its limits. But it's also really interesting to see that some medication, acetaminophen or Tylenol, that is used specifically, obviously, to treat physical pain, it might also reduce social pain, indicating that they share some biological mechanism or maybe even some neural circuitry that underlies both of those processes. It's also, I think, interesting to think about the types of people that are engaging in relational aggression and whether that is, a good thing for those people. If it's, getting them some sort of short-term advantage, that's probably why they're doing it, or they had examples in their lives that engaged in it. But what happens to the people that engage in relational aggression? Well, tends to be relatively bad things, as you might expect. Children that are that are aggressive relationally are more likely to be rejected themselves and have other emotional difficulties, more likely to be depressed, and more likely to blame others for their problems, other people or things outside themselves than generally. Overall, the more relational aggression you're engaging in as a kid, the more problems you're going to have later in life, with your relationships and with other aspects of your well-being. And this does seem to be even a stronger, faster relationship for girls, that even within a year of engaging in relational aggression, this pattern seems to be borne out. It's might be unsurprising that a lot of the work on relational aggression has been done with children, because this was kind of developed by developmental psychologists, that they wanted to study this because they happen to notice it in children. But we also know that adults engage in relational aggression. They exclude each other. They do mean things to each other. So maybe for children, if you're starting out with this relational aggression, it is bad, but maybe for adults, it's not as bad somehow. So there have been studies on this too, that if you look at, for example, people in sororities and fraternities, in this sample, this was from the University of Minnesota, they collected data on a bunch of people in these groups, and they had them not just fill out surveys about themselves, but about people within their organizations. So they were, providing a lot of data about themselves and their peers, so they could get kind of reflections about how those people were viewed and get reflections on the behaviors they were actually engaging in. So they asked them about themselves and others, all these types of things that were related to relational aggression, like giving other people the silent treatment, threatening to do mean things like share private information, stealing dating partners, excluding people from activities, all these things that we know are related to relational aggression. And what they found is that in these adults, these college students, they were more likely to have these maladjustment outcomes later in, or at the same time. This is just a cross-sectional study where they measured relational aggression and current circumstances. So the more relational aggression someone is engaging in, the more likely they are to be rejected by their peers, less satisfied with their lives, engage in antisocial behaviors, be egocentric, not engage in as much prosocial behavior, be more emotionally unstable, have worse relationships, and actually also engage in self-harm. So there are a lot of very impactful and important outcomes that unfortunately are related to higher relational aggression. So it is not an indicator of like social adeptness to be relationally aggressive. It tends to be something that's related to a lot of other negative outcomes. Just to wrap up overall, I want to talk just a little bit about some other reasons we might be aggressive. So I talked about social learning theory a bit ago, about how we learn from example, basically, and other people's reinforcement histories. But it's also important to note that, like I mentioned earlier, we don't just learn negative behaviors from people. We learn all sorts of other things like positive behaviors. And if we watch people from an early age control themselves and not engage in aggressive behaviors, then we're going to, learn those things and internalize those things. And this is something hopefully is going on at an early age, and it's actually one of the main reasons that Sesame Street, the TV show, it's obviously very popular, and lots of studies show that it has, positive impacts on children. Not just watching TV in general, but Sesame Street specifically. But it in part was started so people at a young age would have more positive examples to look at, and might be less likely to engage in these types of behaviors later in life. But if we have people that are already aggressive and we weren't able to intervene earlier in life, are there other ways we can prevent aggression? And our old pal, Sigmund Freud, who, if you have taken intro psych and talked about him a bit, he's a real bizarre character in psychology who had a lot of ideas, some of them right, some of them very, very wrong, but a lot of them pretty interesting. Freud suggested something called catharsis, something you've probably heard of, but basically what it boils down to is something we might call like venting, basically, letting off steam or something like that. He suggested that that's kind of a way we get rid of aggressive energies. And some researchers more recently wanted to actually test if that was the case, that venting or catharsis actually helps us get rid of aggressive feelings or be less likely to engage in aggression. So people in this study, they wrote an essay about something that was important to them, and then were told, no matter what, that the topic, or that the essay was one of the worst they'd ever read. So just some really harsh feedback, no matter what the essay actually was like. Then the researchers manipulated whether the people engaged in venting or catharsis or not. Did they punch a punching bag for 2 minutes to get that energy out, or did they just sit and do nothing? So engage in catharsis through this physical venting, or just sit around, basically. Then they did one of the two kind of classic things that psychologists like to do. One thing that psychologists like to do for aggression is to let people measure out amounts of hot sauce that they're going to make somebody else drink later on. They have all kinds of goofy cover stories for this, and there's dozens and dozens of these hot sauce studies that if you give someone more hot sauce, that's more aggression, and it's kind of an acceptable way to get past the review boards to say people are being more aggressive. Another one, the one they did in this study, was they were playing a game where they got to give blasts of noise through headphones to another person. And they got to choose how loud the blasts of noise were going to be. So that's how they measured aggression. Were the people in one of these two conditions more likely to engage in higher blasts of noise? And what they found is that the people engaging in catharsis gave 40 times longer and more intense noise blasts than the people who just sat around and did nothing. So remember, everybody got insulted with their essay. Everybody was told their essay was bad. Some people were engaged in catharsis, some people didn't, and the people that engaged in catharsis had way more aggressive behavior afterwards. So kind of puts a lot of doubt into whether catharsis is a really useful thing. So the next time you are feeling frustrated, the best way to avoid aggression is probably not like punching something or screaming or going for a really intense run or something. It's probably more like just relaxing or sitting around and maybe even just doing nothing and letting yourself calm down a little bit. All right, that wraps it up for aggression, and so I will be back to talk about conformity and obedience.